Wright was born in the Norfolk village of Erpingham in 1958, one of 4 children. He grew up in a military family, living on RAF bases around the world with his father, Conrad, a retired corporal.
He's a normal child. I mean, no aggression. He's a typical boy that just wanted to play.
But family life was far from happy, and Wright's mother left when he was just 8 years old. Wright and his siblings stayed with their father, who went on to remarry.
Whilst he was living with me, there was never a problem. Never see one even. He was happy. He had little barneys, I suppose, with his stepmother at times when he weren't a bit mischievous, if you like. But it was nothing that you would sort of think about an hour later.
Steve was not a particularly bright young man, but cheery enough in his own way. Left school at 16 without any qualifications to speak of, and got a job working as a chef on the ferries which sailed from Felixstowe to the continent.
By the early 1980s, Wright had become a steward on the cruise ship, the QE2. And it was during this time he reportedly spent money on sex workers during trips to Thailand, which some experts believe may have altered his perception towards the opposite sex.
I think he's got an expectation of women. Women are there to perform a service for him, to play a particular role. They serve a function for him, and that's something that we continually see throughout the rest of his life.
He would often return home from sea penniless. The world's media descended on Ipswich, and the cameras were all pointed at the police.
I think this case was one that attracted so much attention because it was unfolding in front of our eyes. This was the era of reality television when that started to become very popular. We were seeing it as it unfolded on 24-hour rolling news, and you never knew what was going to happen from one day to the next.
Detectives told prostitutes to stay off the streets, but their warnings were largely ignored. A local news crew interviewed one of the girls anonymously.
Why have you decided to come out tonight?
Because I need the money. I need the money, you know.
Despite the dangers?
Well, that has made me a bit wary about getting into cars, you know.
But presumably you will do that tonight?
Well, probably.
The woman interviewed was Paula Clennell.
Paula Clennell, she had children, and she was always trying quite hard to change her life. You know, she was happy when saw her, you know, nice girl, but yeah, she tried quite hard, you know, to get out of it, you know, because it's a very hard thing to get out of the addiction if you still live generally in the same town. But yeah, she was trying, you know, to get away from it and change her life, bless her.
Just 6 days after that news report aired, Paula Clennell was missing. In December 2006, the police in Ipswich were under mounting pressure to catch a prolific serial killer. The bodies of 3 dead prostitutes had been found in just 10 days. They had no clues or potential suspects, and the killing wasn't about to stop. 2 more young women had gone missing. 24-year-old Paula Clennell, who'd been interviewed on the news just days before, and now police receive reports of a 5th missing woman, 29-year-old Annette Nichols, the best friend of fellow prostitute Jade Reynolds.
Annette was a girl, for me, that I was so humbled to know. You know, she always took time for me. She'd want to know if I was all right, if there's anything she could do. She'd do anything for anybody else. She was always well kept. She'd greet you with a smile and a happiness. You know, you felt all right when you was with Annette. I did. I could think, oh yeah, wicked, there she is, you know. It was a relief because I know that I could talk to her, she'd understand my problems. So when she went missing, that's kind of like tearing out a piece of my heart.
As the police searched for Paula and Annette, there was a macabre inevitability in the air amongst the mass of international journalists who'd gathered in Ipswich.
There was almost certainly going to be another discovery. Where was it going to be? Who was it going to be? It was nail-biting, and whilst it can't be described as fear, it was really palpable. You sensed that from the people in the town, you sensed it from your colleagues, but also from other colleagues from other media organisations and the police as well.
On December the 12th, another body was found in Levington, just a mile away from Nacton, in the same woods where Annalie Alderton had been discovered days before.
While somebody was out walking their dog, they stumbled upon the body of a fourth victim, just a few metres away from the main road in Levington. In the undergrowth, also this time not in water. Again, the DNA was important in this case. But what seemed quite strange about this one is that it almost had an appearance of a rushed approach, that this body was deposited by the side of the road, albeit a few metres off the main road. It had the appearance, or it seemed as if it had been done quickly.
The police sent a helicopter up to survey the woodland for evidence. As it circled the area, they made a further gruesome discovery. Another body was lying in the woods only 100 yards away. The naked bodies were those of the missing women, 24-year-old Paula Clennell and 29-year-old Annette Nichols.
I don't think I'll ever get back what I had with Annette, with another girl. You know, this is the most beautiful woman that I'd ever known, that had become quite important to me, that I could trust. You know, and now it's not there. I didn't go out after that. I was quite sensible, because, like, I emotionally couldn't go out and work on the streets after Annette was found.
5 women had been murdered in Ipswich in just 6 weeks. The press had named the killer the Suffolk Strangler.
Alderton and Clennell, they were both asphyxiated. That was the cause of their death. In the other cases, the changes after death really prevented pathology giving a definitive answer, although I think it's reasonable to assume that someone who's killing 5 people in a short space of time probably used similar methods.
Interestingly, none of the 5 victims showed any sign of sexual assault. So it isn't a rape murder. It's not, oh, I've satisfied myself, now I'm going to kill you, murder. It is a targeted murder without a sexual element.
He is very much feeding off the media frenzy that's being created around his crimes, and he's increasingly feeling even more in control of what's going on. So he's changing the way that he's doing things, and he's looking at the reaction from the media when he does that, and he's absolutely loving it.
He believes he's fulfilling something. Maybe he's convinced himself that he's clearing the world of prostitutes. They're all dumped really quite close to each other. Demonstrates that he thinks he's doing something in his own fantasy world that is cleansing the world of evil, or cleansing the world of dirt, or cleansing the world of inappropriate sexual appetite. We'll never know. I don't think Wright probably knows now. All I do know is that he had to be caught, because he wouldn't stop until he was.
On December the 15th, Tanya Nichols' dad, Jim Jewell, made an emotional plea for the killer to turn himself in.
Tanya has been taken by someone who needs to be found. We ask for anyone who knows this person or persons to come forward and contact the police.
With increasing pressure to make an arrest, police decided to question a local 37-year-old man.
He was identified because he had spent considerable time in a radio car talking to a radio journalist and other TV journalists.
I spent a bit of time with him to try and get to know his relationship with the girls. There was a kind of an understanding between them that you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours.
He was loosely associated as a friend of one or more of the girls who were murdered, and at that stage he became of significant interest in the inquiry. There was a very strong feeling from some of the media people present that this man was the right man and should be looked at more seriously.
With a suspect in custody, detectives received a lead from the forensics lab. The 3 bodies that were found on dry land did have DNA evidence on them. In a 1 in a billion chance, the DNA found on all 3 women was the same. But whose was it? The DNA was run through the national database and police got a match. But to their surprise, it wasn't the man they had in custody.
At that time, and as it still stands today, if a person is arrested or convicted of an indictable offence or a serious offence, they can have their DNA taken and held on the database.
The DNA matched that of a local man who'd been convicted of stealing £80 from a pub till in 2002. 48-year-old Steve Wright.
And it was that match which led to significant additional work, including then the CCTV evidence, which showed a vehicle being used by Wright moving between some of the locations around the relevant times. So he became a major suspect in the inquiry.
Over just 6 weeks, 5 prostitutes had been murdered in Ipswich. The police finally believed they'd found the killer, 48-year-old Steve Wright, whose DNA had been found on 3 of the bodies. Wright had not been a suspect at any point during the police investigation, even though he had been stopped during routine checks of the red light district. Whilst the world's media was focusing on a local man who police currently had in custody, Wright was put under surveillance. Peter Sutcliffe is one of the most infamous killers in British history. For 5 years he evaded capture while brutally murdering 13 young women across the north of England. It was an investigation with twists and turns and a case that still haunts the British public to this day.
For years, women and girls felt that simply leaving their homes at night meant taking their lives in their hands.
When Sutcliffe was eventually apprehended on January the 2nd, 1981, it brought an end to a manhunt that had both terrified and captivated the nation. The press had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper.
For women, it was a very frightening time, and they were stuck in this awful position of being told they shouldn't go out at night. It had an enormous social effect on the country.
As well as his 13 victims, Sutcliffe had attacked at least 7 more women. His arrest was a huge relief for the under-pressure detectives at West Yorkshire Police.
He attacked at random. We couldn't anticipate his moves. The whole of the north of England was held in a grip of terror, really, by this man. There was a sort of, I can only describe it as a Gothic-type cloud over the area.
But the Yorkshire Ripper's story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the market town of Bingley on the outskirts of Bradford, West Yorkshire.
He was the youngest of quite a large family. His brothers and sisters were all of strong character. They were all working class, could look after themselves. But Peter was a shy boy and very much attached to his mother.
His mother was somebody who was very much dominated and controlled by his father. So I think he had quite a lot of sympathy for his mum and he thought the world of her as a child. But Peter was somebody who was quite shy, quite awkward, he was quite skinny and scrawny. And I don't think he ever lived up to his father's expectations. And I think that planted that seed of shame in Peter Sutcliffe that would come to shape the rest of his life.
Sutcliffe's awkward demeanour as a child manifested into a dysfunctional adulthood, demonstrated in his early career choices.
Peter Sutcliffe had a variety of different jobs throughout his life. He worked as a gravedigger for quite a period of time, and it was reported that he stole things from the corpses that he was burying. Now that suggests to me that he wasn't horrified or repulsed by dead bodies, and that's something that would be quite influential later on.
On Valentine's Day 1967, 21-year-old Sutcliffe met Sonia Shermer. The pair began a long-term relationship, eventually getting married in August 1974.
The relationship that he had with his wife, Sonia, appeared to have been a decent one, and I think he would have treated her fairly well, because she served a purpose for him. Women like his mother and his wife, he saw as carers and nurturers, people who would look after him. Other women, I think he saw somewhat differently. I think Peter Sutcliffe's view of women is very black and white. They are either Madonnas or they are whores. So they're either these perfect domestic angels or they're these sinful creatures.
These opposing views on women collided with one another when a family revelation dramatically altered 23-year-old Sutcliffe's world. His mother, whom he'd looked up to as a child, had been unfaithful.
His mother had had an affair with a policeman, and his father had decided to confront his wife at a hotel where she was meeting this particular man, and took Peter with him.
Peter's father basically humiliated her and said, look, I know all about what's going on, and the children found out as well. So I think this kind of further cemented ideas as to what women were, what could be expected of them, always to be cautious and wary of them.
I think there was every possibility that after seeing his mother and seeing what happened, that possibly preyed on his mind and affected his attitude towards women.
Sutcliffe began to visit the red light districts of Yorkshire and find solace in prostitutes. But his feelings for these women would soon lead to violence and eventually murder. On the morning of October the 30th, 1975, just 12 miles away in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the body of 28-year-old Wilma McCann was discovered in a local park.
Wilma McCann was a Scottish woman who had come down to Yorkshire. She was working as a prostitute. She was very hard up, and it was very difficult for her because she had young children, young family to support. And I think that was the only way she felt she could get enough money.
The attack on Wilma McCann set in motion what would become a clear pattern and regular method of ambush by the killer.
His modus operandi was to use a ball-peen hammer and was to strike them very hard and very fast on the back of the head so they fell unconscious. He used his hammer and hit her over the back of the head, and then he stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest and abdomen.
But the police were no closer to catching the killer, and 3 months later, on the 20th of January 1976, another woman was murdered in Leeds. 42-year-old wife and mother Emily Jackson, who'd vanished after a night out at her local pub. Emily's son Neil was 17 years old at the time. He remembers receiving the tragic news on that fateful morning.
I've come downstairs. My dad's loading one of the vans up for work, and I'm getting my boots on ready for going to work and having a pot of tea, when they were knocking at the door and it opened the place. And that's when I first knew. And it was first knew when, like I said, for Dad, when the police knocked at the door. I can still remember it plain as day.
Again, a hammer had been used in the brutal attack. Emily had also been stabbed a total of 52 times with a screwdriver. Like Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson had been working as a prostitute to make ends meet.
It was just to help the family in dire straits, is what I've been told afterwards. When family were in hard times work-wise, she went elsewhere, but I didn't realise till well after.
This time, police were able to recover from the scene a key piece of evidence. On Emily's right thigh was a very firm and visible footprint from a size 7 Wellington boot.
For some inexplicable reason, he stamped on her thigh with such force that it left an imprint of the sole of his boot on her thigh. Now, police tried to trace that boot, or the manufacturers of the boot, which they did, and then try and find out people who had bought them, but it didn't come to anything.
Once again, the trail went cold. It was over a year until a murder with a familiar MO took place in Leeds. On the morning of February the 5th, 1977, the body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson was discovered. She'd been savagely murdered, another prostitute killed with a hammer. West Yorkshire police were suddenly dealing with a serial killer. What they didn't realise is that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous series of murders in British history. Less than 3 months after the death of a third victim, Irene Richardson, the killer struck again. On the night of the 23rd of April 1977, 32-year-old prostitute Patricia Atkinson became victim number 4. She was murdered in her own flat, this time not in Leeds, but in nearby Bradford.
She believed that if she invited customers into her flat, she was safe because all the killings had taken place in isolated parks or back alleys. So she thought she was safe, but she wasn't.
The killer hit Patricia 4 times around the head with a hammer and then mutilated her body with a knife. This time detectives found a clue to link the murders of Patricia Atkinson and Emily Jackson.
The police found the same boot mark on the bedclothes at Patricia's house, Patricia's flat, as they found on Emily Jackson's thigh.
This crucial link confirmed the authorities' worst fears. The killer was expanding his hunting ground and he seemed to have a favoured target. All 4 murder victims had been working as prostitutes. On the 17th of November 1980 in Leeds, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was hit over the head, stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. An attack that bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper. But Jacqueline Hill would be Peter Sutcliffe's final victim. Within 2 months, a routine police stop would lead to one of the most sensational arrests of modern times. The capture of the Yorkshire Ripper.
Just after New Year, or January 2nd, 1981, Peter went to Sheffield and picked up a prostitute. On the same evening, a policeman with a lot of years of service decided to show a young rookie round Sheffield.
The 2 police officers spotted Sutcliffe's car near offices on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield's red light district. They decided to approach and talk to the pair.
The cops asked, what's your girlfriend's name? He said, I don't know, we've only just met. And the policeman said, you know, I haven't just fallen off a Christmas tree. So he already realised there was something odd going on.
Peter said that he needed to urinate, and the officers let him go up to a wall by the side of the building. While he was away, the young police officer did a PNC check on the registration of the car and found that the plates were false. So Peter was arrested and taken to Dewsbury police station.
Once down at the station, Sutcliffe was searched. He wasn't carrying any weapons, but this time detectives weren't going to let him slip from their grasp.
So one of them thought, let's go back to that place where we spotted him and let's see if he did leave anything when he popped out of the car saying he was going to have a pee.
The police returned to the scene of the original arrest.
They found the hammer, the intended murder weapon, and they came back with them. And gradually after that, Peter Sutcliffe realised that the game was up, and eventually he confessed. And his only condition was that he be allowed to tell his wife, Sonia, before it became known to the general public that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper.
It had been over 5 years since the murder of Wilma McCann, but detectives finally had the Ripper in custody. Huntley was born in Grimsby in Lincolnshire on the 31st of January 1974. He had a turbulent time at school and was often the target of bullying.
So I think this created a bit of a sense of shame in Ian Huntley, something that is often at the root of a lot of men like him in terms of what they go on to do. So he started off as somebody who was always the kid that was a bit odd, the odd one out, the one who's a bit of a loner.
In December 1994, Huntley met 18-year-old Claire Evans. They had a whirlwind romance and were married within weeks.
His wife, Claire, quickly found that he had a terrible temper. She later claimed that she feared for her life and that he would often put his hands round her neck.
Ian Huntley is somebody who is not capable of having a normal relationship with a woman, so he moves very quickly because he wants to maintain a sense of control within his relationships. So he will breeze into women's lives this knight in shining armour full of charm and compliments and will kind of try and wind them in.
Huntley's marriage didn't last long. His wife Claire had started a relationship with his younger brother Wayne. Despite the marriage being all but over, Huntley refused to grant her a divorce until 1999 to prevent their relationship from becoming official.
He'd always felt incredibly threatened by his younger brother. He took the attention away from him when he came into that family. And because of Ian Huntley's narcissistic tendencies, he's always going to feel he's being outdone by his brother.
While still married to Claire, Huntley fathered a daughter with a 15-year-old girl in 1998.
I think it would be fair to say that Huntley demonstrated throughout his adolescence and early manhood that he had an unhealthy appetite in younger and younger women.
Well, during his 20s, Ian Huntley preyed on a lot of young girls, underage girls, and the police who investigated the case thought that there were possibly up to 60 young girls that he'd had some kind of interaction with on that level. And he would kind of worm his way into these girls' lives. And they're younger, they're more impressionable, they're easier to lure in.
In 1998, 24-year-old Huntley appeared at Grimsby Crown Court, charged with both burglary and the rape of an 18-year-old girl. Both cases were dropped due to lack of evidence, but he was gaining a bad reputation across Lincolnshire.
He was an insignificant little man who, on the surface, wouldn't say boo to a goose. Unfortunately, he had no conscience and would do whatever he wanted when he wanted to do it.
In February 1999, Huntley met 22-year-old Maxine Carr, and after dating for just 4 weeks, they moved in together.
She was naive, impressionable, and he was an interesting figure to her, I think. She found him perhaps, I would hesitate to call him charismatic, but at least interesting, and did not discover the violent side to his nature that his wife had.
Maxine Carr was a very easy target, in a way, for Ian Huntley, because at this point in his life, he's managed to hone those skills of hooking women in, being quite superficially charming and manipulative, and saying the things that they wanted to hear. So he's got quite a well-rehearsed script at this point in time.
On the 15th of August, 11 days after the girls went missing, Sky News decided to retrace their steps, which meant interviewing the last person to see them, local school caretaker Ian Huntley, the boyfriend of Holly and Jessica's classroom assistant, Maxine Carr.
It's 6:15 p.m. The timeline on that Sunday night, the 4th of August, puts the girls here, right in the forecourt of the village college, the local education centre. We know they'd been to the sports centre just across the road a few minutes before to buy some sweets and were carrying on walking through what would have been very familiar territory. Their primary school, St Andrews, is just across the back of the village college here. How do we know they were here at 6:15? Well, we have an eyewitness. Ian Huntley here is a familiar figure. Evening, Ian. You're the school caretaker. The girls, Jessica and Holly, would know you, and they saw you on the front doorstep. What went on?
I don't know the girls. I stood on the front doorstep grooming my dog down. She'd run away and come back a bit of a mess. They just came across and asked how Miss Carr was, as she used to teach them at St Andrews. I just said she weren't very good, as she hadn't got the job. And they just says, please tell her that we're very sorry. And off they walked in the direction of the library over there.
And you may, as it turned out, have been the last person to actually chat to them before they vanished.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Huntley looked like an unassuming, ordinary little bloke with a soft voice who wouldn't hurt a fly.
He was a slight withdrawn sort of character, but at the time he seemed reasonably credible. It seemed like a credible story. That's where the girls would have walked. So when I talked to him, I had an open mind. I certainly at the time wasn't thinking, this is the guy that's done them harm.
Maxine Carr was also keen to appear on camera.
We interviewed her in the middle of the village and got her to tell us about her relationship with the girls.
They're ever so funny, they're brilliant, they're kind to everybody. They're they wouldn't say a bad word about anybody, and they love their families and everything, which is why nobody believes that they would ever run away. They was very close to all their family. This is something I'll probably keep for the rest of my life, I think. It's what Holly gave me on the last day of term. She was very upset, and that's the kind of girl she was. She was just lovely, really lovely.
In the conversation, we realised a few minutes afterwards, she spoke about the girls in the past tense. When I was talking to her live, didn't really occur to me, but a couple of minutes afterwards we said thanks very much and she walked off, and my producer said, just play that tape again. I'm sure she was talking about the girls in the past tense.
Often the perpetrator is among the searchers, not without exception, but often because they want to admire their own handiwork.
Could it be the person responsible for Holly and Jessica's disappearance had been under the noses of detectives from day one? On the 16th of August 2002, 12 days after the disappearance of 10-year-old schoolgirls Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, local caretaker Ian Huntley and his girlfriend Maxine Carr had been taken in for questioning by police. Interviews given by the pair on Sky News had roused the suspicions of detectives.
We were starting to think, wow, these two people really could be involved in something to do with these girls. They're close enough to it. They've clearly aroused police suspicion at this stage.
But after just 7 hours, they were released when Carr provided Huntley with an alibi. She claimed she was with him in their home on the night of the girls' disappearance.
It wasn't until about 10 or 11 at night that we heard that police released them, which we found interesting, and I got a phone number from Maxine Carr. I thought, well, worth a gamble, I'll just ring and see if I get through to them. And extraordinarily enough, I did. I got straight through to Maxine Carr. And I said, I gather you've been interviewed by the police. What happened? How are you? She said, well, we're fine. I can't tell you anything about it, but it's all right. Huntley then grabbed the phone off her and I guess wanted to end the conversation quickly. So he said, well, thanks for ringing. Yeah, we're fine. Nothing to report. The police have let us go. Nothing going on. Thanks a lot. Thanks for ringing. Bye.
Once Huntley and Carr had been questioned, further searches were carried out at their home and at Huntley's place of work, Soham Village College.
It was quite clear as we checked back that something had happened on the Friday night during the interviews with Huntley and Carr. It had triggered further searches, and because they suddenly saw Huntley as perhaps the key figure here, they went back over his territory, his home, and his workplace. And it was then that they began to find evidence that he had abducted the girls.
On the 17th of August, investigators got their biggest breakthrough in the case yet. In the bins at the school where Huntley worked, they found the burnt remains of 2 football shirts, tracksuit bottoms, shoes and some underwear. Forensic expert Peter Lamb identified the clothes as those belonging to Holly and Jessica.
One of the crucial items in this particular case was the tops that the little girls were last seen in. These were unusual, and this helped us tremendously to build up a picture of the types of fibres that it would be easy for us to find.
Whenever two human beings interact, there is an exchange of material, be that something as tiny as DNA, up to something less subtle like a fibre, up to saliva or bodily fluids, blood. We leave a mark on each other, and no matter how hard one tries to destroy all of that evidence, there will usually be something left to say that two people have been interacting. There is this constant interaction of material that allows forensic scientists to draw conclusions and ultimately to come up with very strong evidence that places one person in one place with another person and builds the case.
Forensic scientist Peter Lamb had the girls' clothes, but now he had to link them forensically to Ian Huntley. And it didn't take long.
During the examination of the items from the bin, I found 5 human head hairs. These head hairs were compared with Holly's hair and Jessica's hair. They didn't match either of those two, but they did match Ian Huntley's hair.
This vital evidence led to the arrest of both Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr on the very same day, the 17th of August, on suspicion of abduction and murder. Fred and Rose's horrifying story began many years before. In 1969, 28-year-old Fred West was married to his wife Rena with a young family of his own. But he had his eye on a 15-year-old girl named Rosemary Letts. Rose and her family had recently moved to the Gloucestershire area, whereas Fred was born and raised in the local village of Muchmarkle.
Well, Fred was the eldest boy in the family, and he was very much the target for quite a lot of abuse at the hands of his mother. So his mother sexually abused him, essentially, and he lost his virginity to her. And the family was a very self-contained one. Rose's childhood was similar to Fred's in many ways, in that it was completely dysfunctional and antisocial and abnormal. So she was abused by her father, who started raping her from a very young age. So what she took to be normal, what she took to be acceptable in terms of behaviour within a family, really was anything but.
Fred pursued Rose. He was used to getting what he wanted. When the couple met, there was instant attraction.
Rose lived in the same village that Fred had a caravan. They met at the bus station in Cheltenham. She said that he could charm the birds off the trees, even though his appearance was shabby. He had not very clean teeth.
Well, these were two incredibly damaged people. They'd both come from abnormal families, and I think when they met, what they saw in each other was something familiar. So they both would have realised that the childhoods that they had were far from normal, but with one another they felt that familiarity.
Maybe it was something that Rose gave off implicitly, but something in Fred connected with what had happened to Rose and the way she was and the way she'd been treated by her father, and it was like a union of two souls.
I think it was the perfect storm. You know, the chances of these two people meeting was, it must have been a million to one, but unfortunately they did.
By 1970, just a year after meeting, they were living together in Gloucester with Fred's stepdaughter Charmaine. His wife Rena was nowhere to be seen. Rose was pregnant with the couple's first daughter, Heather.
I think in the early days, perhaps the more dominant partner was Fred. He was older, he was more experienced, he'd seen more than Rose had. You know, she'd come from this incredibly contained family. But I think as their relationship developed, she started to find her feet and find her confidence. And I don't think that Fred ever really trusted her.
For Rose and Fred, it was all about sex from the very, very beginning. Fred was the originator, but he found the perfect sorcerer's apprentice, the perfect partner, someone who shared his lust and someone who understood him and wanted to perform for him.
I think we have a lot of trouble making sense of Fred and Rose's relationship, and the reason for that is because we are people with emotions and normal feelings and ideas of what acceptable and unacceptable boundaries are around relationships. So I don't think I'd describe their relationship as a loving one.
Fred and Rose's traumatic childhoods had a lasting effect on the couple and their twisted approach to family life together. 2 decades later, it's 1992 and Gloucestershire police are searching for Heather West. In 1987, aged just 16, Fred and Rose's eldest child vanished from the family home. Fred had claimed Heather had run away, but she was never reported as missing. But after receiving allegations of child abuse at 25 Cromwell Street, detectives began to look into Heather's whereabouts. Chief Constable Tony Butler was in charge of Gloucestershire Police.
One of the children told a friend at school about what was happening to her. That friend talked to a patrolling police officer, in fact, about what her friend had told her, and it was a result of what the police officer then took that back, and it initiated a child protection process which led to the evidence being gathered.
5 of the West children were placed into care and the police began their investigations. They were interviewed about the darker side of their lives at 25 Cromwell Street.
What it brought to light was a family joke. And the family joke was a simple one. You better watch out, because if you don't shut up and stop causing your dad or your mum any trouble, you'll end up like Heather, 2 down and 3 across in the patio. Fred had laid a patio behind Cromwell Street, was in squares, which was rather like a crossword. The family joke was that he buried Heather at 2 down and 3 across.
This issue, this Heather's under the patio, continued to be raised. And so we started to take this point seriously. We knew Heather had disappeared, had left the home, so we tried to trace her. And despite massive amount of inquiry to try and find her, she just literally disappeared off the face of the earth.
In February 1994, the police decided to find out if the family joke was more serious than the children realised. Armed with a warrant, they began to dig under the patio of 25 Cromwell Street.
When they arrived with the warrant, Fred and Rose were at the house and they went into the back garden and the officers started digging the garden.
Sensing the end was nigh, Fred asked to be interviewed by police.
Fred asked the officer if they could go down to the police station, and so they left. Fred said that he admitted that Heather's remains were in the garden, but the police were looking in the wrong place. And later that day, he returned with the officers and he indicated where he thought Heather was buried. The following day, officers digging in that area recovered a femur, and that was taken for examination by the forensic pathologist, who confirmed it was human remains. And that turned out to be one of Heather's remains.
Rose was being questioned at Cheltenham Police Station when the news reached her and her solicitor, Leo Goatley.
When Rose was told that Heather's remains had been found, she gasped loudly and was very distraught. How do you interpret that? Was that a mother's shock and distress, or was it a murderer's distress at being found out? At that time, I believed that she was shocked and distressed, and that she didn't know the extent of Fred's activities. And of course, at that stage, it wasn't about serial killing, it was about Heather. But of course, the thing unravelled pretty quickly with the excavation.
The police found more than they'd bargained for under the patio at 25 Cromwell Street.
When they found remains, they found not just 2 legs or 2 thigh bones, but 3. The interrogating detective said to West, well, unless Heather had 3 legs, there's another body. Ah, yes, Fred says, without drawing breath or hesitating. That must be the other girl, that'll be Shirley.
The police were about to unearth all the secrets that Fred and Rose West had been hiding at 25 Cromwell Street for over 2 decades. Secrets that would shock the entire nation. On March the 5th, 1994, the world's media had descended upon the home of Fred and Rose West in Gloucester. Police had exhumed 3 bodies from their back garden: their daughter Heather, Fred's pregnant lover Shirley Robinson, and missing teenager Alison Chambers. Now detectives were moving their search inside the property and began excavating the cellar at 25 Cromwell Street.
We started the excavations in the cellar. It was a difficult place to do excavations, and we had to be very careful about recovering the bodies. And on the first day, we did find 2 sets of human remains. One turned out to be Teresa Siegenthaler, and the second remains were Shirley Hubbard.
It was clear to pathologists that much had been done to try and hide the identity of all the murdered girls.
With Fred and Rose as victims, one of their hallmarks, as it were, was that the fingers and toes were removed. I think we can hypothesise that there may be different reasons for that. Simple cruelty would be one, but obviously most people know that fingerprints are a very good way to identify somebody. So removing them, particularly in the 60s, 70s, 80s, before DNA technology was really recognised, would be a way to limit the chances of that person being identified.
And that was one of the big, one of our difficulties when we were doing the investigation, trying to identify the human remains, and in particular Teresa's remains, because there was no evidence she'd been anywhere near Gloucestershire. But we were able to, in liaison with the Metropolitan Police and the missing persons, to come down to a sort of a short list of people that it could be. And then through using forensic techniques, we were able to be satisfied that we had identified her remains.
As the cellar excavation continued, officers escorted Fred to a field near his home at Muchmarkle. He told them if they dug there, they'd find the body of his first wife, Rena, not seen since 1971, a year after Fred and Rose had moved in together. Rena and Fred had been married for 9 years, but she was never reported missing.
So he was taken out to the fields, and he pointed out in one field, fairly close to a hedge line, where he said that he'd buried Rena Costello.
There were now 6 victims, and back in the cellar at Cromwell Street, even more bodies were being exhumed. Juanita Mott, a former lodger at the house, missing since 1975. And Carol Cooper, last seen walking home from the cinema in 1973. Plus 2 familiar names the police had been looking out for, Lucy Partington and buried under the family bathroom, Linda Goff.
This was a tragedy for these young women. I mean, all murders are tragic for the victims and their families, but it was the scale of this, I think, that took the media's attention. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible that 2 people could abduct young women or lure them to their house and subsequently, you know, sexually abuse them and then kill them. I mean, it is on a scale that's almost incomprehensible.
By the 8th of March 1994, less than 2 weeks after beginning their search at Cromwell Street, police had found 10 victims. Most of them had been buried 2 decades ago, when Fred and Rose were at their most prolific. Levi Bellfield was born into a Romany gypsy family in Isleworth, West London, on the 17th of May 1968. He was one of 5 children. Aged 10, Bellfield lost his father to leukemia, and as a result, he formed a very close bond with his mother.
Bellfield was very much a mother's boy, much beloved of his mother. It was a close-knit family, brought up in West London, in what was effectively once a huge community of travellers, and was groomed to thinking from the very early days that he was very special, that there was something particular about him. His mother encouraged him in that view.
I think during his childhood he was a bit of a tearaway. He was a young lad who wanted to do what he wanted to do, and not much stood in his way. So he was often kind of larking around and getting into a bit of trouble at school, but nothing completely out of the ordinary.
By the time Bellfield was 13, he'd had his first brush with the law and was arrested for burglary in 1981. It would not be the last time he was in trouble with the police.
I believe Bellfield occupied what you might describe as the halo of Levi Bellfield. I am greater than anything. He was above the law, above suspicion, operated entirely under his own steam, in his own way, at his own time.
In 1989, 21-year-old Bellfield set up home with a girlfriend. They went on to have 4 children together.
He could literally charm the birds off the trees. This is a 19.5, 20-stone man with a huge neck, almost occupying his entire shoulders. He wasn't an attractive man, but my goodness me, he had the gift of the gab, and he didn't half use it to his advantage, particularly when it came to girls.
On March the 21st, 2002, 13-year-old schoolgirl Amanda Dowler, known affectionately as Millie, went missing from her home. Journalist Martin Brunt remembers that day very well.
She was on her way home. She got off the train, was going to walk the half-mile or so back to her home. She was in her school uniform, very identifiable. This was daylight, busy time of the afternoon, lots of people around, but nobody saw anything.
Millie had phoned her father to say she was heading home, but never arrived.
She seemed to have disappeared into thin air. There was CCTV footage of her getting off the train at Walton Station. Some very blurred images of cars and the odd person in the street where she was headed home, but nothing more than that. And it became clear very early on that police were really struggling to find what had happened to her.
The last sighting of Millie Dowler was on Station Avenue in Walton, just 50 yards from the home of Levi Bellfield.
The search has taken in stretches of water, including the River Mole, but police have been concentrating on ground near the busy station and interviewing commuters.
We have nothing that gives us any positive indication that she's gone off of her own volition. Equally, we have no positive information that she has been taken off the street and abducted. At this time, all of our lines of inquiry are open.
On September the 18th, 2002, 6 months after her disappearance, the body of Millie Dowler was found by a group of foragers amongst the trees of Yateley Heath Wood in Hampshire.
So Millie was identified through dental records. She was known to be missing. Dental records were obtained, and then they were compared to the remains that were present, and sadly for her family, it confirmed that that's who it was.
It was clear to forensic ecologist Professor Patricia Wiltshire that Millie's body had been in the woods ever since she disappeared.
I was able to tell the police how long each bone had been there and how long ago it had been moved, because the bones were moved around by animals, you see. There was no doubt in my mind, really, that she had been there since the early spring.
How Millie was killed remained a mystery.
The degree of change that the body goes through after death, particularly in the sort of timescales we're talking about with Millie Dowler, really hinders what the pathologist can see, what the pathologist can say. It doesn't mean that there's nothing we can see or say, but clearly the less we have to work with, the more difficult it is.
One likes to be objective, one likes not to think of the remains as a person, one likes to just look for the evidence and you try to be objective. And then, of course, they take you into a scenario where you become fairly emotional. Well, you can't help it. It's an emotional sort of scenario. And then it comes a bit of a shock, really.
The police had no suspects and no forensic evidence. And just 5 months after the discovery of Millie Dowler's body, only a few miles from Walton-on-Thames, another young woman was murdered. At around midnight on the 3rd of February 2003 in Kingston, London, 19-year-old Marcia MacDonald caught the bus home after a night out at the cinema with friends. It was the last time they would ever see her. Walking home, Marcia was attacked from behind less than 100 yards from her parents' front door. Colin Sutton was one of the lead detectives with the Metropolitan Police at the time.
Well, Marcia was found on the street where she lived, 10 or 15 doors down from her parents' house. Local resident heard a noise, heard her whimpering, if you like, and called police, and she was found there with this terrible head wound, and she was taken to hospital and died 2 or 3 days afterwards. Marcia was killed with a single blow to the back of the head with a heavy implement.
Forensic evidence suggested the weapon used was most likely a hammer.
Hammers are effective striking tools, so it's no great surprise that you can cause very severe damage to a human skull with relatively little effort with an effective hammer. You'll often see lacerations, they're often curved to match the profile of the hammer, and you'll often see skull fractures. They're quite often depressed, so pushed inwards towards the brain, because the hammer is exerting its force so focally.
Nightfall and detectives in Hampton still work on, but though they've searched tirelessly all day, they remain baffled as to who carried out this apparently random attack.
Often these things happen and are carried out by somebody the victim knows. In this case, I'm sure police looked at boyfriends, family members, but very quickly ruled out any kind of suspect like that. So it soon became obvious that this was a stranger murder, and those are very rare. So very soon, very quickly after Marsha's murder, people in the area became very concerned that there was a killer on the loose.
Subsequent investigations led police to a mentally unstable 16-year-old who wasn't competent enough to be charged or even interrogated about the incident.
And as a result, he was sectioned and was put into to some sort of institution compulsorily. And although he hadn't been charged with the offence, everybody kind of thought, well, it was him, and so we can put that offence to bed, and you know, we've solved that, if you like.
But then investigators noticed a possible link to similar attacks that had happened in the area in the months before.
There was another 16-year-old schoolgirl that she was thought at first to have slipped over in the snow and banged her head, and it was only then when Marsha was murdered that police looked at this occurrence some 2 months previously and realised that that could have been an assault as well. And they went back to this girl who'd been treated in hospital and were able to talk to the hospital staff and look at the description of her wounds and some photographs and conclude that the likelihood was that she too had been attacked but had survived. We found a couple of other offences as well. Again, young ladies had been attacked in the street and hit over the back of the head, and in both these cases they'd survived.
However, none of these other victims were able to identify the attacker.
They just, you know, said I was walking along, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in hospital some hours or some days later. So we didn't have any kind of clue or sighting that led us towards the suspect for it, because they just simply couldn't remember it.
All of the attacks seemed to be totally unprovoked. Could they all have been committed by the same perpetrator, the man who murdered Marsha McDonnell? By joining the dots, Colin and his team could link Bellfield to another vehicle, the car that ran Kate Sheedy down.
And one of the times that he was arrested was in May 2004, when he was arrested for kidnap, which was kidnapping the landlord of a pub near where he lived in West Drayton. And nothing happened about it, and the landlord in the end said, oh no, it was just a prank that went wrong, don't worry about it. Didn't want to press charges, no charges were brought. But the crucial thing was that that arrest took place, and that abduction took place indeed, in a vehicle, and that vehicle was a white Toyota Previa. Kate Sheedy had been attacked in Isleworth, not by being hit across the head, but by being run over by a large vehicle. And she said that this vehicle was something like a Ford Galaxy. Of course, that's exactly what a Toyota Previa is.
The White People Carrier. That was actually on my drive about 2 weeks before he ran Kate Sheedy over with it. Only because he asked me if he could leave it there for a couple of nights, and I begrudgingly said yes.
And I got somebody to go and do a check on the number plate of the Previa that Levi had been arrested in, and I remember her saying to me, Governor, I think we might have hit the jackpot, and said it was white. We now had somebody, Levi Bellfield, who had the right kind of white van that was used at the time Amelie Delagrange was murdered, and the right type of vehicle at the time that Kate Sheedy was run over.
Bellfield was now the prime suspect. At dawn on the 22nd of November 2004, police raided his West Drayton home.
In the attic is a naked Levi Bellfield. He'd covered himself up in the hope that no one would find him. Well, they did.
The story of this cold-blooded killer begins over 35 years ago in the picturesque city of St Albans in Hertfordshire. Joanne Dennhey was born in 1982 and began life in a loving and secure family home. Very few could have predicted this bright and intelligent young girl would turn into a sadistic monster with a taste for violence.
By all accounts, she was starting off in life with what we might say is a perfect foundational upbringing.
Joanne Dennhey appears to come from quite a normal family. She had a relatively uneventful childhood. She's one of two siblings. Her mother worked in a supermarket, her father worked as a security guard and for a telecommunications company. And from the outside, they appear to be a normal family.
She had a sister to which she was very close. They had even developed a secret language. She played netball for the school. She was a very normal, quite bright schoolgirl.
But Dennhey's idyllic childhood was curtailed as she entered her teens.
She started to experiment with drugs, she started not going to school, and she linked up with a man called John Trina.
Her parents, they were at their wits' end. They didn't know what to do. They tried to keep her locked up or bring her home from school. The teachers tried to reprimand her. And the more they tried to control Jo, it was Jo saying, "Stuff you." And it was literally like throwing petrol on a fire.
Dennhey and Trina ran away together, embarking on a turbulent relationship. Despite Dennhey's violent outbursts, the couple had 2 children together and eventually settled in Cambridgeshire.
I think quite a lot is made of the fact that Joanne Dennhey misused alcohol and drugs, but I think she's well aware of the fact that this is going to be discussed, and she knows that these offer quite a convenient excuse for her behaviour. And alcohol and drugs and other substances can disinhibit, but that's assuming that people have got those moral standards to begin with, and Joanne Dennhey didn't have them in the first place.
A very disturbed woman, she had done a lot of self-harm, of cutting herself and so on. So there were a number of danger signs that this was somebody who was not attuned to society.
As time went on, Dennhey's erratic behaviour intensified. She'd cheat on Trina and leave him and their 2 children for sporadic periods of time. Her drinking worsened and she reportedly began to carry a knife hidden in her boot.
I think she's somebody who perhaps has always enjoyed hurting other people. It's almost like she's this crazy scientist and the world is her experiment.
Finally, in 2009, Trina took the children and fled from Dennhey, afraid of what she might do next.
The company that she was keeping as well, she was surrounded by people who were similarly disconnected. So I think when there was no check or filter or break on her behaviour, she was only going to get worse.
Dennhey had become no stranger to the local police. She'd been in and out of prison for drug offences and was also given a 12-month community order for being in control of a dangerous dog. In February 2012, Dennhey spent 3 days on the psychiatric unit at Peterborough City Hospital, where she was diagnosed with a series of disorders.
She has had various diagnoses attached to her: antisocial personality disorder, psychopathic personality disorder. And these are conditions, they're not mental illnesses. And there's a real important difference between the two, because people with personality disorders know the difference between right and wrong. They're fully rational, they're in control of what they're doing, but they choose to do it anyway. So she's not somebody who feels bad, who feels remorseful, who regrets things. She does what she wants to do, and she doesn't care about the consequences.
By 2013, 31-year-old Dennhey had settled in a small bedsit in Byfield, a housing estate in Peterborough. But the local residents were unaware of her troubled past or her violent nature. One of Dennhey's new neighbours was Michelle Bowles.
She was polite to me. But I wouldn't melt on her mouth, basically. She was well-spoken to me and never swore. She was actually quite pleasant, do you get what I mean? I showed her respect. She loved babies. She was excellent with children. I didn't have a problem with her. When I saw her or spoke to her, I said hello, she said hello back.
But other residents were not so sure. Michelle's friend John Chapman lived in the same building as Dennhey. He was a Falklands War veteran who'd fallen on hard times.
I don't know what regiment he used to be in. I should know, because the man of stories used to say. It's just John being smiley all the time and happy and like, nice to know.
But John Chapman didn't smile when Joanne Dennhey was around.
John was petrified. John came in mine and he said, on several occasions, there's this mad woman moved in. She says she's going to get rid of me, whatever way she can.
And he was right to be afraid. In just a few months, Joanne Dennhey's threats would turn to violence, and John Chapman would be dead. 31-year-old Lucas Slabozewski had moved to the UK from Poland in 2005. After meeting Dennhey a few days previously, he began exchanging text messages with her. On the 19th of March 2013, Slabozewski went to visit Dennhey at one of the houses she was staying in on Rolleston Garth and was never seen alive again.
She almost certainly lured this man with the promise of some kind of sexual favour. But without a moment's hesitation, she stabbed him through the chest once, very, very hard, killing him almost instantly.
Slabozewski had been coaxed into Dennhey's deadly embrace. She led him to believe the pair were in a relationship. He willingly and naively entered the trap she'd laid for him.
Everybody that comes into contact with Joanne Dennhey, it's like falling into a spider's web, and you can't get out. Men can't get out. They become entranced by her for all sorts of reasons.
Dennhey had complete disregard for the life she'd just taken.
Dennhey puts this poor Polish man's body in a wheelie bin and then shows it to a 14-year-old. And so, look how clever I am. I've killed this man in the wheelie bin.
But it was only a temporary solution. Dennhey knew she couldn't keep Slabozewski's body in a bin. She had to dispose of it quickly, but she needed help. She called upon one of her friends, 47-year-old Gary Stretch, who was more than willing to assist.
Joanne Dennhey is quite bright, she's quite clever, so she's able to exert quite a lot of control in her interactions with other people, and that's what makes her exceptionally dangerous. Now, looking at the relationship that Joanne Dennhey had with her accomplices, I think she was able to charm these men. She was able to kind of lure them in, really, and they would have been flattered by her attentions. You know, here she is, this younger woman wanting to spend time with them. These were men who had quite dull, quite boring lives, and I think they were quite excited to get involved in what Joanne wanted to do.
At 7 foot 2 inches tall, Gary Stretch towered above Dennhey's slight frame. An unsuccessful burglar, Stretch was absolutely infatuated by her twisted and lethal charms.
Gary Stretch and Joanne Dennhey met when both of them were on parole from prison for various offences. She realised that she could use him to do whatever she wanted. He was her bodyguard, her minder. And that's how they formed this team, which became so overpowering for Stretch that he would do anything for her.
I don't think Joanne Dennhey had any emotional feelings towards her accomplices whatsoever. They were useful to her at the time, and she just cast them aside when she was finished with them.
With the help of Stretch, Dennhey dumped Lucas Slabozewski's body in a ditch in rural Thorney Dyke, just 10 miles east of Peterborough city centre.
When we look at the two attempted murders, you know, towards the end of her spree, this is something altogether different. These are strangers, these are men that she doesn't know. So I think what was happening here was that she was upping the ante, she was getting bored. You find that psychopaths tend to have a proneness to boredom and a need for stimulation, so she was even applying that to her murders.
Remarkably, both men survived these attacks. Although their injuries were life-threatening, they were still able to give the police descriptions of Dennhey and the instantly recognisable star tattoo on her cheek.
By now, the police sirens are going all round, and blue lights are going all round Herefordshire. They're panicking. It's like somebody's kicked over a wasp nest.
The local police had been alerted to her spree and were about to put an end to her bloodshed. They cornered Dennhey and Stretch on Newton Close in Hereford.
Two officers turn up and they spot this car with Dennhey in it, talking to the dog on the back seat, while Gary Stretch is trying to negotiate stolen property at the front door of one of his associates' house. They arrest Dennhey on the spot. Gary Stretch and one of his friends do what they call in police parlance a runner. They jump in another car and speed off. Something like a car chase goes on for about 20 miles, and then Stretch decides to get out and run for it. Now, Mr. Stretch is not built for speed, and of course he's very unfit, and he's stopped. And he turned around to the police officer and said, you've arrested me, Joe and I would have been the next Bonnie and Clyde.
Footage of Dennhey in custody at Hanniford police station just 40 minutes after stabbing 2 men and leaving them for dead showed her laughing and joking with the arresting officers.
One mark for attempted murder and murder. Attempted murder and murder is something. So going down for Sunday Rose. Excuse me.
Joanne Dennhey is like a chameleon. She's become a very accomplished actor, so she will play to whatever audience is in front of her. She can be charming and sound very educated and literate. And at the same time, to another audience, she could sound quite rough and quite downbeat. So she's really honed these skills of responding to the people that are around her.
The following day, April 3rd, 2013, the bodies of Dennhey's other 2 victims were discovered just outside of Peterborough. In a ditch on farmland at Thorney Dyke, investigators found 31-year-old Luka Slabozewski and 56-year-old John Chapman, a close friend of Michelle Bowles. Griffiths was born on Christmas Eve 1969 in the town of Dewsbury in West Yorkshire.
There doesn't appear to be anything really out of the ordinary in terms of the family that Stephen Griffiths comes from.
He had 2 very sort of caring, loving parents, a stable marriage. They were moving up in the world, you know, good, solid Yorkshire folk, but then it all went pear-shaped. Now, I think that happened when Stephen's parents, Moira and Stephen Sr., split up.
Griffiths had always been close to his father, and he didn't react well to the breakup.
We know from listening to some of the reports of people he went to school with, his peers, they've reported that he was a bit of an oddball. He was slightly strange. He would collect hunting knives and he would talk about violence in a way that other children wouldn't.
He became very, very withdrawn, very, very difficult to get on with, very disengaged, but also he was observed being sadistic towards animals. In the back garden of the house they lived in Wakefield, neighbours saw him shooting birds and dismembering them.
When we look at serial killers who have been abusive towards animals when they were children, that is indicative to me of somebody who is trying to gain control. So they turn their attentions to creatures that they can wield power over, and often that's small animals. I think those early indicators were there, but he certainly didn't come from the hugely dysfunctional background that we see other serial killers come from.
Despite his unruly behaviour, Griffiths had a high IQ, and his dad worked hard to send him to a £9,000 a year grammar school in Wakefield.
He went to private school, and I think that gave him a kind of veneer of respectability. Had he been a young lad at a badly performing school, you know, in a deprived area, I think perhaps his behaviour would have been problematised much earlier. He would have been on the radar of police and social services and agencies like that much earlier. But I think social class and middle classness provides a bit of a protective layer for some people who go on to commit murder and serial murder, because we don't want to think of middle-class kids as to go on and do things like that.
In 1986, at the age of 16, Griffiths dropped out of school, and it wasn't long before the troubled teenager had his first brush with the law.
Stephen Griffiths started getting into trouble with the police at the age of 17. He was trying to steal some goods from a supermarket in Leeds. When the supermarket manager tried to stop him, he produced a knife and slashed him across the face. The wounds were so severe that the victim needed 19 stitches.
Griffiths was arrested and spent a year in a juvenile custodial unit. When he was released, aged 19, he wanted to make a fresh start and enrolled in a psychology course at the University of Bradford. But he was soon in trouble again. In 1989, Griffiths was arrested for possessing an offensive weapon, an air pistol, and sentenced to 100 hours of community service.
He got into further trouble when he felt he'd been slighted by some fellow students, female students at the college he studied at. He went up to them, 4 girls, produced a knife, held the knife to the throat of one of the young girls, and asked her very menacingly what she thought she was laughing at. Understandably, the girl was terrified. He didn't actually attack her, but it was clearly a serious offence.
This time, the authorities had had enough. Griffiths was sentenced to 2 years in prison. During this time, he spent 8 weeks at Rampton Secure Hospital in Nottinghamshire, where the psychology student's behaviour was assessed by a professional.
The psychiatrist described him as a sadistic schizoid psychopath. He said he seemed to relish the very idea of killing and maiming people, and really made it absolutely clear that he had a personality disorder which would make him a very, very dangerous man indeed.
Psychopaths are people who are essentially emotionally empty. They don't have the same range of complex feelings that the rest of us do. They tend to lack remorse. They have a shallow affect, a kind of a shallowness of feeling. They are prone to boredom. There's a need for kind of stimulation all the time. They can't feel real empathy for other people, so there's an inability to put themselves in someone else's shoes. So it's that kind of coldness, that kind of detachment from feelings and from empathy, really.
After his short time at Rampton, Griffiths was moved to Leeds Prison, where reportedly he openly talked to his fellow inmates about murder. Just 2 days after Suzanne's disappearance, they received news of some horrific footage captured on a CCTV camera in a nearby block of flats, the home of Stephen Griffiths.
So everything becomes clear less than 48 hours after Suzanne's disappearance, when the caretaker at Homefield Court, the block of flats where Griffiths lives, is reviewing the CCTV footage for the weekend. He's looking at the footage taken from the camera outside Griffiths' flat. It's a Monday morning. Like any other Monday morning, he's just sort of sleepily winding his way through this film. And then all of a sudden he sees this figure emerging from Griffiths' flat, running, pursued by this figure, which he immediately recognises as Griffiths, carrying what looks like a crossbow.
The girl captured running for her life was missing woman Suzanne Blamires.
He took her to his flat. She quite quickly, I think, realised that she was in grave danger and ran out.
You see Griffiths chasing after her. You see him shooting at her with a crossbow. You then see him dragging her back into his apartment by her legs. And that wasn't where it ended, because afterwards he comes up to the camera, he sticks his middle finger up to the camera and he brandishes the crossbow.
In a kind of defiant, angry gesture towards the camera and anybody else who might be looking at him.
On May the 24th, 2010, after viewing the footage, police immediately raced to the scene of the attack, hoping that Suzanne Blamires may still be alive.
Armed police officers turn up at Homefield Court. They storm up the stairs, storm into Stephen Griffiths' flat, expecting really some resistance. Stephen Griffiths just gives himself up meekly and tells police, somewhat inexplicably, that he's Osama bin Laden.
Griffiths was immediately arrested and taken to Halifax police station. Suzanne Blamires was nowhere to be seen. Griffiths had achieved exactly what he'd set out to do. With his self-proclamation, the case had now picked up immense media attention, and the nation was in shock.
Can you confirm your name to the court, he was asked. Barely audible, the psychology graduate believed to have been studying criminology replied, "The crossbow cannibal."
After he announced himself as the crossbow cannibal, of course, there was only one story that the whole media were talking about, and that was it. It just took over. I was just sitting there speaking to a colleague. We said, "Have you seen this? Can you believe that?" At that time, we'd never seen anything like it before. Most of the time, these courtings are kind of anodyne, sterile affairs. But there, this guy had, stood up and announced himself as this self-confessed serial killer. And really, we were just flabbergasted.
But could Griffiths really have eaten his victims, or was this just more bravado from the macabre showman?
I think looking at, did Stephen Griffiths cannibalise his victims? I think it's a possibility, because this is a guy who really didn't appear to have any boundaries around his killing behaviour. But at the same time, he's aware of the power of that statement, the impact that saying he's done that will have on his reputation. And he'd come up with that moniker, the crossbow cannibal. So he had to claim that he'd done that, even if he hadn't.
Evidence found in Griffiths' flat suggested he may actually be telling the truth.
There was a certain amount of DNA evidence on Griffiths' kuka, which, of course, you know, sort of tends to back it up. But also, I think it's a case of there being no real reason to disbelieve him. And Griffiths, in his interviews with the police, was more or less truthful. He was incomplete, but he was truthful. And I think as far as they knew, he didn't make up any outright lies. And if you think about Stephen Griffiths and what he tried to do, achieve notoriety by somehow contriving this series of very unpleasant, very gruesome, very shocking murders, then the idea of cannibalism would fit into that kind of jigsaw.
I think when we look at the amount of time that Stephen Griffiths has spent with the bodies of his victims and what he's done with those bodies, he allegedly cannibalised some of the victims, he's dismembered the bodies, he's taken pictures of them. This is somebody who's quite comfortable around death, around dead bodies and the various things that come along with that. Other serial killers are more repulsed, you know, by dead bodies. So it's the crime itself. It's the act that's important for some, whereas I think it's the process that was important for Stephen Griffiths.
He's one of Britain's most prolific serial killers. Over the course of 5 years, during the late 1970s and early 80s, he killed at least 12 men, confessing to as many as 15, the majority of whom have never been identified. Nilsen thought his crimes were simply being flushed from existence by dissecting the bodies piece by piece, boiling them, and then disposing of them down the toilet. But a routine drain inspection at his London home in 1983 would lead to his downfall.
We found a number of interesting items which can only be established once pathologists has examined it.
Are you satisfied that they are, in fact, human bodies?
This is a possibility, yes.
Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland. He spent the early years of his life in this house. According to his mother, he was a quiet boy. Little, if anything, marked him out from the ordinary.
After his parents' marriage broke down, he spent the majority of his childhood living in the nearby village of Stricken.
His father was largely absent. He grew up with his mother and his siblings and his grandparents, and his family reformed and his mother remarried. So he had a lot of disruption, he had a lot of chaos. But lots of children have that.
He was isolated from an early age, and the isolation found solace in representations of people who weren't alive, like pictures in a storybook. He'd cut the picture out and take it home. That's what he liked, because that picture couldn't argue with him. It couldn't say no to him.
His mother has actually talked about the way that she would cuddle and have, you know, physical warmth with her other children, but she felt repelled by Dennis. She was quite cold towards him. And this was even when he was just a little child. So right from the beginning, he's learning from his mum that he's different and that he's kind of repulsive in a way.
Due to the absence of his father and the distant relationship with his mother, Nilsen grew particularly close to his grandfather, who worked as a North Sea fisherman.
When he came back from sea, the grandfather would take him down to the beach, and they'd walk up and down the beach, and he'd tell him stories of what happened at sea. His grandfather was the one person he could relate to. This was the one tactile relationship he had, the only person who touched him.
But in 1951, Nilsen lost the one family member that he looked up to the most.
I firmly hold to this view that the death of his grandfather profoundly affected him.
His mother kind of skirted around the topic and said, yeah, your grandfather's just not very well and he'll be back. And then when the funeral came around and the body was laid out in the front room of the house, as it often is in these communities at this time, he kind of thought his grandfather was just asleep. So you've got this really traumatic event going on in his life, and he's really struggling to make sense of what's going on. And he's feeling pretty rejected, really, because he's got this really close relationship with his grandfather. One minute he's there and one minute he's not.
I'm utterly convinced that his idea of death and his idea of love were fused at that point. And after that, he could only love people who were dead.
On December the 29th, 1978, he met a 14-year-old boy called Stephen Holmes, and Nilsen knew there was only one way to guarantee his latest lover would never be able to leave him.
Stephen Holmes was a very young boy, and he was trying to get himself something to drink at a pub in Cricklewood. Nilsen offered to help out with the drink and then brought him back to his flat.
Stephen Holmes was never seen again. In a desperate attempt to stop him from leaving, Nilsen murdered the 14-year-old boy by strangling him with a tie before drowning him in a bucket of water. It was the beginning of a familiar pattern for Nilsen.
Essentially, he would frequent the gay pubs and gay bars and would meet men that he found attractive. He would meet men that he wanted to form relationships with, and they would go back to Nilsen's place.
His chosen victims, not necessarily all homosexual, but all vulnerable, I think you could say, or susceptible to somebody offering them a bit of comfort or a meal or a drink or whatever. But he obviously had a tendency to go for handsome young men or people who made themselves available to at least just hang out with him for a while.
But he didn't have the social skills to maintain a normal relationship at a normal pace in a way that wouldn't send people running for the hills. So the only way to keep people there was to kill them.
With Stephen, Nilsen initiated what would go on to become a familiar ritual for him.
The modus operandi of Dennis Nilsen was very similar for most of his victims. They would be plied with drink.
He would have a tie. By the time the victim was now drunk, almost comatose, going to sleep, he would put the tie round his neck and strangle him that way.
And if they were unconscious but not dead, then he would drown them in a bath or a bucket.
After that, he would get himself a drink, light a cigarette, and then spend the next few hours looking after the body.
He would get them out, and he would sit and watch television with them. He would clean up the bodies.
He would clean it, dry it, dress it, put it comfortably in a chair. He would speak to the corpse in the chair. These were his pretend friends.
So what we've got going on here, there isn't like massive sexual depravity. What he was creating was a picture of domesticity. He would sit there and watch television with them. So he's killing for company, but in the most grotesque way.
It sounds in many ways like a very dark horror film, the way that he behaved. And I think that was part of the fascination with him, which exists to this day.
Dennis Nilsen's murderous career would continue undetected for 5 years.
I think one of the reasons Dennis Nilsen got away with it for so long was that even at that time, which is post the legalization of homosexuality, the disappearance of young men who were gay was not treated with the same amount of respect and energy as the police, I think, would treat it nowadays.
By February 1983, 37-year-old Nilsen had moved home and was living in a top-floor flat on Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London. After residents complained about the drains being blocked, a plumber was called in to investigate.
And they found what looked like bits of flesh. Nilsen suggested that could be somebody had flushed their Kentucky Fried Chicken out or something like that, and that would be the explanation for little bones and flesh.
But the plumber wasn't so sure, and the following morning, February the 9th, 1983, he called the police. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. remembers that day well.
My phone rang, and it was Peter Slade, the uniform inspector in charge that particular day. And he said to me, "Could you possibly come up here?" He said, "I've got a bit of a problem. I'm not sure what I've got, but I'd like you to see it." And he showed me a drain with an inspection plate cover open. And he pointed out that some bits of flesh had been hauled out of the drain at the bottom. So I said, well, let's have another haul around inside the drain, get anything else that's in there. And the scenes of crime officer that I had with me managed to pull out 3 or 4 pieces of flesh, each about 4 inches long, 1 inch wide, and 3 little bones with a knuckle at each end. And when I looked at them, I thought these bones had probably come from a human hand.
Peter took the remains to Charing Cross Hospital, where resident pathologist Professor David Bowen confirmed their suspicions.
He said, it's human, and he said, by pure luck, you've brought me a piece of neck, off the neck, and your victim has been strangled. He said, there's a clear ligature mark on this piece of flesh.
Most of us think of hair as being hair, but different parts of the body, the hair is quite different when you look at it down the microscope. And so the pathologist in the Nilsen case was identifying that this piece of skin had hair that fitted with being from someone's neck. So despite the difficulties of fragments of tissue being found in a situation like a drain, identifying the characteristic ligature mark on it, it's pointing you very strongly towards strangulation.
And I looked at him and I said, "You sure you've not been watching too much TV, Prof?" And he said, "No, it's as clear as a bell." He said, "This is human." So that only meant one thing to me, that somebody must have been murdered and flushed down the toilet.
Astounded, Peter drove back to Cranley Gardens and waited outside the flat all day until Nilsen returned home from work.
My first introductory words to him were, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J from Hornsey Police Station. I've come about your drains." And he looked at me and he said, "Since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" I said, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you." And you could smell immediately the decomposing flesh. I said to him, "Look, your drains were blocked with human remains." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just pushed my face a little bit nearer to his and said, "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" And he said, "Okay, it's in plastic bags in the front bedroom." Even at that point, his demeanour didn't change at all. He was just as he was when he came in the front door. He was okay. Maybe the game's up. And he was relaxed about it. So we walked him down to the car. I told him I was arresting him. So I drove the car back, and then Steve McCusker was obviously thinking to himself about all the body parts that were in so many different bags. And he popped the question to Nilsen, "Are we talking here about one body or 2? And Nilsen said neither. He said, "I think it's 15 or 16. And I can remember the steering wheel sort of shaking in my hands.
It was a crime that horrified the nation. In the summer of 2012, 12-year-old schoolgirl Tia Sharp disappeared from her grandmother's house in South London, prompting one of the most publicised search campaigns in British history. But on the 10th of August, it came to an abrupt end, with a twist so horrific it seemed impossible to comprehend. Tia's body and her killer had been right in front of the cameras the entire time.
The sense of loss here is mixed with all sorts of emotions. People feel cheated. Their week-long campaign was a desperate mission to find Tia Sharp. It ended with the 12-year-old found dead in her own grandmother's home.
The killer was 37-year-old Stuart Hazell, a man that Tia looked up to and affectionately called Grandad. Detective Nick Scholar remembers encountering him during the search for Tia.
Throughout all of my meetings with him, his demeanour never really changed. He was always a very quiet person. He didn't come across as being particularly intelligent or articulate, and he answered questions very simply.
But behind Hazell's quiet nature was a ruthless, callous killer.
Stuart Hazell committed the most horrible of murders, yet was able to lie to his family, lie to his friends. To do that, he must have been a particularly calculating and vile man.
His story begins over 40 years ago. Born on the 26th of May 1975 in Kingston-upon-Thames, Surrey, Stuart Hazell was introduced to a life of dysfunction from an early age.
His father was in and out of prison, so there wasn't a lot of stability. It was quite disorganised, it was quite chaotic. He spent quite a lot of time in the residential care system, he was moved around quite a lot, and I think that did have quite a significant impact on his personality because he didn't really form attachments with other people. So that kind of absence of warmth, that absence of closeness in those early years is something that really does shape him.
By the time Hazell reached his teens, he'd already begun a life of petty crime.
Stuart Hazell started drinking when he was about 13, and that got him into quite a lot of trouble. So he ended up with his first conviction when he was 14 years old.
It was a pattern that continued into adulthood. Between 2001 and 2010, Hazell was in and out of prison for offences ranging from racially aggravated behaviour to drug dealing. In 2003, 28-year-old Hazell began dating Natalie Sharp, a single mother with a 3-year-old daughter called Tia. But the relationship was in no way conventional. After they split up, he began seeing Natalie's mother, Christine Bicknell.
Well, I think Stuart Hazell is somebody who is quite predatory, who identifies people that he can get things from, essentially. And he had a relationship with Tia's mother that lasted all of about 2.5 weeks. And very soon after that, he started a relationship with Tia's grandmother, which was much more longer lasting.
Although 10 years her junior, Hazell moved into Christine's home on the Lindens estate in New Addington, South London in 2007. He soon settled in and enjoyed spending time with Christine's now 7-year-old granddaughter Tia. But he struggled to find work.
Well, Stuart Hazell didn't really have a regular form of employment. He was in and out of prison so much, and it's very difficult to maintain regular, well-paid, steady employment when you have a lengthy prison record. So he would go from job to job, doing work cash in hand, and all of that type of thing.
I said, right, whatever happens, we run throughout. So even if we break, we keep the recording going, so the mic's on constantly. And I said, just go with it. Whatever happens, go with it. So we got in, we set up, and Stuart was really anxious. He was very anxious. And what I needed from him was a really detailed account in real micro detail about what happened from the point that Tia came to the home to the point that she was last seen by him. So minute by minute, as much as he could, breaking that down, and that's what I did. And I got him to talk in real detail, because I knew that every single piece of that interview would be poured over by the police, because by the Thursday morning, after the phone call that I'd had saying Stuart would give an interview, I knew this was an interview with a killer, no doubt about it at all.
Well, if they believe what they read in the papers, they can do whatever they like, because I know deep down in my heart that Tia walked out of my house. She walked out of there, and I know damn well because she was seen walking down the pathway.
Body language expert Robert Phipps was certain Hazell was lying.
I'd loved her to bits, she's like my own daughter.
Stuart's behaviour throughout this interview is inconsistent with somebody who is in turmoil, worried, anxious about Tia Sharp being missing. His body language is far too animated. He's shrugging his shoulders a lot. People shrug their shoulders when they're saying, I don't know. But he's giving supposedly truthful statements and saying, I don't know.
I know she made that track down to that way.
And I think he was struggling at times, sometimes, to be able to remember what he necessarily said to everybody else. And of course, the more detail I asked of him, the more difficult it became for him to remember exactly what he'd said. Because what he couldn't do, of course, was give me something that he'd given to somebody else differently.
Did you do anything? I said, well, no, I bloody didn't.
Stuart adds in a lot of detail, which is superfluous to his actual answer.
From the co-op, we just got on the T31 because you come out the co-op and take a right, cut down this little pathway and a bus stop, T31 bus.
This is to pad out the story because it's not the truth. So he's adding in other bits that make it sound truthful. Now, when you talk to most people who recall a story, they don't tell it in a logical, orderly sequence. They start saying something and then they remember something else, and the conversation actually, or the statements that they're making, chop and change.
Crossed over by the zebra crossing and come home.
During normal conversation, people blink around about 20 blinks per minute. If you look at Stuart's behaviour, his blinking rate is around about 40 to 45 blinks. This is very high and would indicate that he's actually nervous about what's going on during the interview.
He seemed to me somebody who was insincere. His breaking down, his almost tearful performance smacked to me of somebody who was trying to put on a performance. The fact that he was sitting there with the T-shirt, find Tia, I think there was a picture of her in the background, all suggested to me that this was a man trying too hard to appeal for information when he knew exactly what had happened to her.
She walked past me from the front room to go out, and she walked out the front door. That is all I know.
What he's doing is he's looking away from the interviewer and down and to his right. This normally indicates that he's using the left-hand side of his brain. This is where you go to construct pictures. If it's a memory that you have in your head, you would generally look up and to the left, which means you're using the right-hand side of your brain, which is generally where most people hold their visual memory.
It's bad. It is bad. No one knows. We're getting false hope. We're getting people seeing sightings. Yeah, it's good to get sightings, but we want 100% definite sighting. Do you know what I mean? It's crazy.
The week-long search for missing 12-year-old schoolgirl Tia Sharp had come to a tragic end. Police had found her body in the loft of her grandmother's house. On Saturday, the 11th of August 2012, Stuart Hazell, Tia's grandmother's partner, was being questioned on suspicion of her murder.
What can you tell me about the murder of Tia Sharp, Stuart?
Oh, a couple of minutes, you must listen, please.
OK.
On the same day, a post-mortem was being carried out at Croydon Mortuary.
Clearly, Tia had been dead for a week, and unfortunately, the body had begun to decompose quite badly.
The thing with decomposition is that the rate can be very variable. It depends on all sorts of factors. If you've got somebody who's wrapped up to prevent the smell getting out, they're potentially in somewhere that's not particularly warm, which will retard decomposition. In this particular case, the passage of time and the changes that had occurred to the body in the post-mortem period really limited what pathology could tell you.
The police still had no evidence that Hazell had killed Tia, but a further search of the loft had uncovered her clothes, glasses and, hidden elsewhere in the house, something truly sinister.
On this occasion, found pushed behind the door frame on the inside of a cupboard door, above head height, was a memory card for a digital camera. We recovered deleted images from that card that were quite disturbing. There was some where clearly he had searched the internet and found pictures of girls that were not dissimilar looking to Tia, in that they had glasses and a similar hairstyle. But worst of all on that memory card was perhaps the most grotesque image I've ever seen. So we took the photograph to show a pathologist, and he pointed out the hypostasis on it, which is essentially how the blood pools on a dead body. And this pathologist was of the opinion that that was a picture of a dead girl.
Also recorded on the memory card were a number of videos.
One was of Tia sitting on a settee Looked like she's rubbing suntan lotion or some kind of cream into her legs. Clearly, he'd given the impression perhaps he was sending a text or something, but all the time he was secretly filming Tia.
One of the clips undeniably linked the camera to Hazell.
Another video image was particularly unnerving. It showed Hazell filming Tia when she was asleep. He'd obviously gone into her room and was walking around her with the phone in his hand. He also just briefly filmed his own shadow on the wall, menacingly standing over her.
On Saturday, August the 11th, 2012, Stuart Hazell was charged with the murder of Tia Sharp. It was a case that spanned 2 decades. By the time Peter Tobin was found guilty of murdering teenage hitchhiker Dinah McNichol in 2009, he'd already been in prison for 2 years. He was serving life sentences for the murders of Angelica Kluke and 15-year-old schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton. The 63-year-old serial killer and rapist had buried all 3 girls across a 15-year period, 1 in Scotland and 2 on the south coast of England.
Another awful discovery at 50 Irvine Drive. A body bag thought to contain the remains of Dinah McNichol, brought out from what was the most ordinary of houses. It is no longer.
I think what sets Tobin apart for me is the sheer relentless brutality of him. A man who genuinely paid no attention whatever to anything but his own basest instinct. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and could get away with it.
Former Detective Superintendent David Swindle from Strathclyde Police first came across Tobin after the body of Angelica Kluke was discovered at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow in 2006. The 23-year-old Polish student had been missing for 5 days.
Coming back to the church today brings it all back to me. The horrors of what must have happened here. Unbelievable. You could never imagine it. A place of worship desecrated by Peter Tobin doing what he did to Angelica Kluke.
But when they arrested Tobin, police were convinced this wasn't his first murder. David set up Operation Anagram, a task force charged with finding out more about the life and crimes of Peter Tobin.
When we looked at his life in Operation Anagram, we found that he frequented places like this: churches, religious establishment, homeless persons, hostels. How many people frequented the places that Tobin frequented? How many people did he meet that were vulnerable at that time, that had no relatives to report them missing? How many of these were missing and were never reported missing that Tobin has killed? We'll never know. Tobin knows the answer.
Throughout his life, Tobin, who was born and brought up a Catholic, had a persistent connection with the Catholic Church, and at various points during his periods on the run or disappearing or adopting false identities, took refuge in Catholic churches and Catholic communities. I think it was simply that that was somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he knew how to conduct himself, where he could hide in plain sight. He could conceal his true nature behind the facade of a church handyman or a member of a Christian community. And that was a very safe way to conceal the reality of what he wanted.
To Tobin, nothing was sacred. He took advantage of the open nature of the Currans and the community of St Patrick's.
He was with us maybe about 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And then he started giving Father Jerry a hand in the church, and he's doing bits and pieces. People don't understand, you can be with somebody a full day and they never spoke. You know what I mean? People find that hard to understand. There was nothing to sort of, it was a yes and no. That's what it was, a yes and a no.
Peter Tobin was an incredibly manipulative individual. He wasn't particularly emotionally complex himself, but he had a really good understanding of other people's emotions. He knew what other people needed to hear, and he used that to get what he wanted.
Kathy, however, had concern for the ominous stranger who joined their community.
I says to Dennis that there was something far wrong with him.
I wasn't too sure what it was, but as far as I could understand, that the jigsaw with Pat McLaughlin wasn't all fitting together. There was something not right there.
But Tobin's next step was more evil than any of them could have predicted. Angelika Kluk was a 23-year-old student from Skotzow near Krakow in Poland who was working as a cleaner in St. Patrick's Church. On the 24th of September 2006, she disappeared. Dennis broke the news to his wife.
He said, that girl, Angelika Kluk, we don't know where she is. And I went, what do you mean? He said, she's vanished. All her stuff's there, all her credit cards and everything are all up in their room, but she's vanished.
Police scoured the church and grounds for evidence and began interviewing members of the community. They discovered that the last person seen with Angelika was the church handyman, a man named Pat McLaughlin. Charity worker Dennis provided police with a photograph of McLaughlin.
At 6 o'clock it went in the evening news nationwide, and within minutes their phone line was jammed to say, that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin.
Police now had their main suspect. They quickly discovered that Tobin had a violent past, and the investigation escalated at rapid speed. David Swindle was the lead detective on the case.
I became involved in the investigation when it was established that Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender, had been with Angelika Kluk. And soon after my involvement, I arranged for the church to be searched again by specialist officers and specialist teams. There's a garage attached to the church, and that is where Peter Tobin was with Angelika Kluk, working on some woodwork. He called her his little apprentice. He actually was interviewed by a police officer when the missing person report was made, and he stayed there for another day, and when the heat was on, he left. When he realised it was being treated as a major investigation, he left. This is someone that was cool and calculated.
Police launched a nationwide search for Peter Tobin.
Mr. Tobin is considered a potential risk to members of the public. Any person who sees this man is advised not to approach him.
It was a name that sounded all too familiar to crime journalist Martin Brunt.
It was a shock to find what had happened, but what made it particularly interesting for crime reporters who were covering the case was that police were appealing for a man called Peter Tobin, and it rang bells. It took me and others back to the days of 1993. They didn't realise that he was, in reality, Peter Tobin with a dreadful history of sex crimes. He was a man hiding in that community under a false name, had duped the church authorities to employ him as a handyman, and of course they were completely innocent of his background.
As the search for Angelika intensified, it became more and more likely she wouldn't be found alive.
We had another search of the church, a really thorough search, because by this time the parameters had changed. There was concern for her safety.
5 days after her disappearance, on the 29th of September 2006, police discovered the body of Angelika Kluk under the floorboards of St. Patrick's Church. She'd suffered severe head injuries and multiple stab wounds after being attacked in the adjoining garage.
It was in there just after the priest, Father Jerry, left on that Sunday. Within minutes of it, someone across the road had heard a scream. He hit her over the head with a table leg. There was splinters in her head, rendered her unconscious or semi-conscious, bound her hands with cable ties, further assaulted her, dragged her in a polythene sheet into the church here and across the church, and put her body under the floor like a bag of rubbish. She was put under there. He stabbed her, whether that happened underneath there or whether it happened outside, and he raped her. He left her dead.
The British public was shocked to learn the truth of where Angelika's body had been hidden since her violent death.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
I think the discovery of Angelika's body was awful enough, that a young woman had died in those circumstances. The fact that she was buried under a church added some sense of horror and drama to the way people reacted to it. The fact that a suspect was somebody who had been working at the church, somebody who seemingly had volunteered to be a handyman at the church, didn't really make sense.
DNA evidence on Angelika's body was confirmed as belonging to Peter Tobin, and his fingerprints were found on the tarpaulin he used to wrap her in.
In forensic pathology, we have what's called Locard's exchange principle. That says that when you interact with another person, you leave something of yourself on them, and you take something of them away with you. Anyone who murders another person, who physically interacts with them, they will leave trace evidence. They will leave DNA, potentially fibres, hairs, all sorts of things.
But Peter Tobin continued to elude the authorities. Despite a nationwide search, he disappeared into thin air.
So things were moving very fast. We have the human remains of a young woman who's been ferociously attacked. Horrible, horrible scene underneath the floorboards. Forensic examination is ongoing. We knew by this time that Peter Tobin had a history of violence, sexual crimes. He had been in prison. He was a dangerous person. Where was he?
David and his team wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. In early October, just over a week since Angelika's murder, they received a crucial breakthrough. Tobin had been spotted, this time using another alias, James Kelly, over 400 miles away.
We got a phone call from the police in London that he'd checked into a hospital in a false name. Someone had recognised him. A Metropolitan police officer went in there and confirmed his identity. And I arranged for a team of uniform officers to bring him back to Scotland.